but we've got a discussion to begin. So thanks all for coming, and thanks also to people who are tuning in online to this On Frontline session at the Conduit Club. I'm Chris Morris. I worked for far too long for the BBC, but I left last year, so I'm now doing various other things. I was a foreign correspondent, including in the United States a long, long time ago, as we discussed. And we're here today well, it's still 18 months, isn't it? More than 18 months until the next US presidential election. But it feels like it's already coming up fast in the world of news. That's partly thanks to Donald Trump becoming the first US president in history to face criminal charges. And also, of course, we have Joe Biden in Ireland this week on our side of the pond, in Northern Ireland earlier in the week, and now, I guess, meeting that extended family down in the Republic. And 2024 looks like it's going to be another extraordinary election, and we have a great panel to talk about it all. With me here in the room is Michael Goldfarb, journalist, broadcaster and author. You make radio documentaries, and many of them about the United States, and also you present the first Rough Draft of History podcast. And also in the room is Julie Norman. Julie is co-director of the Centre on US Politics at University College London, where she's an associate professor. She also published widely on US foreign policy and on polarization in particular. Two other people we will hear from, but I have to warn you, getting journalists into one place all at the same time is a bit like herding cats. So joining us sometime during the session, we hope, is Frank Langfitt, who is on the road with President Biden in Ireland. He's should currently be live on NPR, but the day's agenda has been delayed, so he won't be able to join us probably until after 6:30, as soon as he's finished broadcasting, but he will be dialing up and appearing on that screen, hopefully telling us how he thinks that the Biden trip is growing. He's just taken on a new role. He used to be the London correspondent. He's now going to be NPR's global democracy correspondent, looking at democracy around the world and in the United States. And we're also going to have a couple of contributions from Susan Glasser, who has a weekly column in The New Yorker from Washington, D.C., and is the co-author of The Divider, which is a best-selling book about the Trump White House. Unfortunately, she can't be with us live, so I've recorded a series of questions with her to get her thoughts on where we are in the electoral process. And I think I'm going to start with Susan. And the first clip is maybe 5 minutes long, and then we'll come to Michael and Julie. And I asked Susan about Donald Trump in the wake of his arrest and indictment in New York, and where she thinks that leaves his attempt to regain the US presidency.
The campaign is beginning in very much the way that people might not have thought, but really should have not been surprised by, which is Donald Trump is now the front runner for the Republican nomination. He has been all along, despite the sort of outbreak of what I can only say is, wishful thinking among even many Republicans that he would sort of just move along. The polls have always shown, in fact, that he retained the loyalty of a hardcore support in the Republican Party. And in a divided party, that means he's not only the front runner, but at the moment, kind of an overwhelming front runner for the Republican nomination in 2024. And the indictment in Manhattan by District Attorney Alvin Bragg does not change that. If anything, it might have in the short term kind of shored up Trump's position, or at least reminded people, that he's just not a factor who's going to go away. But I would caution you as well in terms of over-interpreting what this particular indictment means to him or to American politics more generally, because it could be the first of many, and that would really change, I think, the conversation that we're having. It would be something very different if the United States Justice Department and its special counsel chooses to indict Donald Trump either for obstructing justice, withholding classified information that he was supposed to turn back, or playing a role in the January 6th insurrection. Any of those charges would be much more serious, and I think would really reshape our politics.
And other Republican would-be candidates, I mean, as you say, they've taken a bit of a battering. They all had to fall in behind Donald Trump in the last week or so. But if, for any reason, his campaign falters, who emerges?
Well, it's been fascinating to watch Republicans who just, even the ones who are look like they're running against him, like Nikki Haley, who is announced, who served in his administration as his ambassador to the United Nations. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he's been built up as if he was sort of the future of the Republican Party. He's gotten more airtime on Fox over the last couple of years, probably than Donald Trump himself has. And yet, not only is he not beating Trump in the polls, but he's actually been going down. Now, where it could come to help someone like a Ron DeSantis is if Trump looks like he's struggling, looks like he's under fire in multiple courtrooms, that he might even be convicted. Then you could have a situation where you could have someone like Ron DeSantis come and say, look, I'm a younger, smarter, faster Donald Trump. I'll bring you the same policies, the same demagoguery that you seem to like, but without the court dates. And that ultimately could be appealing in 2024, but it's still a long shot right now because I think the Republican Party has been so transformed. There is no snapback to the Republican Party pre-2016. And I think that's partially the reality that is kind of sinking in to Americans right now.
There seems to be at least, I guess, one strand of conventional wisdom which says, all the legal attention and the media attention will help Trump win the nomination, but it won't help him win the center ground to enable him to gain back the presidency. But isn't that just what we heard when he took on Hillary Clinton in 2016 and won?
Yeah, a lot of people are having 2016 flashbacks these days. Certainly Republicans are, because it was a divided and crowded Republican field that let Trump win the nomination in the first place. And Democrats are too. It's a risky business to assume that you know the outcome of events that have not yet occurred. And so, I always sort of cringe when I hear, as I often do in Washington, when I hear Democrats or people who don't like Donald Trump say, oh, but I want him to win the nomination because I think he's the weakest Republican candidate. I would say strongly, history suggests beware.
Yeah. So what about Joe Biden? I mean, he seemed to say the other day he is going to run, he just hasn't officially announced it yet. How does the Democratic Party feel about that? Do they still see him as the best bet to take on Donald Trump?
Well, I think, frankly, it's the Trump factor that even has Joe Biden in the race at this point. And, that's really the striking thing, isn't it? More than 2 years after Trump lost his office, left the office in disgrace after the violence of January 6th. And yet, nonetheless, it's really Trump who's hanging over both parties in many ways. Biden's argument, he's already the oldest American president at age 80. If he runs and wins a second term, at the end of that second term, he will be 86 years old. Nonetheless, his argument is, I'm the only guy who has run against and successfully defeated Donald Trump. The big kind of often not acknowledged factor by the Biden White House is his own choice of vice president, Kamala Harris. She is seen as a weak contender against Donald Trump and not likely to even emerge as the party's nominee if there were to be an open primary process.
And if he were to drop out for whatever reason, as you've said, health could become an issue. But in time for there to be an open primary, what other names should we be looking at apart from Kamala Harris?
It looks like California Governor Gavin Newsom seems quite intent upon running. I think you would have a new generation of candidates, people like Gretchen Whitmer, the Democratic governor of Michigan, a key swing state, of course, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota. I think there would be a lot of people who would run in an open setting. They would not be deterred by Vice President Kamala Harris.
Okay, so that was kind of runners and riders in brief, if you like. And we'll hear again from Susan later, but I want to get a few comments from Michael and Julie. Michael, maybe I could come to you first. A lot of people, Susan says, getting 2016 flashbacks. We know the last two elections have both been pretty extraordinary. What are you expecting coming up?
Well, I can understand why people get flashbacks, and I get 15 of them a day because I had a I applied for press credentials in 2020 to the Trump campaign. I didn't get them, but now I'm on his mailing list, and I get 15 different emails a day asking me for money, and it does make me flash.
Have you given any yet?
No. Although when I want Twitter engagement, I just take a screenshot of what he's asking for and I put it up on my Twitter feed, and I get more engagement than any other kind of tweet that I put out. No, I think that one of the chill pills that I give myself about this is to remember some facts, which is, one, he didn't beat Hillary Clinton. She beat him by damn near 3 million votes. It would have behooved her to campaign in Wisconsin and Michigan in the month of October, as she was advised to do, because those two states were wobbly, and indeed they wobbled away from the Democratic Party, and because of the anomaly of the Electoral College, Trump won. I went back in 2018 and watched the Democrats take back the House. Or they didn't take back the House. Yes, they took back and have a good midterm election. In 2020, Joe Biden, who is ancient, he's a good guy, but he's ancient, won by nearly 7 million votes. So you go from nearly 3 million to nearly 7 million. And then in 2022, instead of a disastrous midterm, as everybody thought would happen, it was actually as good a midterm as an incumbent president's party has had in how many years? Julie, you'll know how many decades it's been. So that's my chill pill, and I would urge people to think in terms of those trend lines, and also think of this, because it seems to me an accurate assessment. The abortion issue motivated the Republican Party for 40 years, and Donald Trump became their nominee because people trusted him to appoint Supreme Court justices that would overturn Roe v. Wade. And now you have the reaction. And the reaction is seen at the moment at the local level. It's an incredible motivator. And so that's my other chill pill. I do think that this dynamism, particularly among young people, young women especially, it becomes, they spent 40 years trying to overturn it, and now they're going to spend, the Democrats will spend probably less time trying to reinstate women's right to choose, don't you think?
Yeah, Julie, I mean, by all means answer that, and more generally in terms of the polarized nature of the debate as we head into election season.
Sure. No, I want to share Michael's optimism, I think, and definitely the abortion issue is one that I'm watching closely with how much of an effect that will have in 2024. I think it did have a big effect in the midterms in 2022. Right now, it's playing out so much at the state level, which is very interesting to watch and observe how differently it's playing out in different states. But I think Republicans are finding that it's the dog that caught the car and is starting to backfire in some of the states that are going with very conservative policies. But I don't think it's a slam dunk for Democrats either in all demographics. So I think both parties will need to figure out how to balance that. Most of the electorate is fairly moderate on that issue, and I think both parties risk overreaching to some degree, but I do think it'll play a big role. I agree very much with most of what Susan said. I am also expecting most likely a Biden-Trump rematch. I think the catch-22 that Susan alluded to is the more Republicans who want to confront or oppose Trump, the more likely it is that he gets the nomination because it splits that vote. And I think he will hold on to a solid 30 to 35% of the party, pretty much regardless of what happens with the lawsuit. So if the rest of the vote continues to split across different candidates who are throwing their hats in the ring, just the math gives him that advantage, even if there are further indictments. So I'm watching a couple different things. The abortion thing I'm watching. I'm hoping that I think Susan is a bit more where I'm leaning in the sense of Democrats I think need to be cautious of not being overly smug about a Biden-Trump rematch. People have been watching the poll numbers for the primaries this week since the indictment, but polls showing Biden-Trump head-to-head matchups since the indictment have also been within the margin of error head-to-head. And I think that's quite notable at this moment, that this is not a slam dunk win for Biden if Trump is the nominee. I think Democrats need to be a bit cautious also in, I I think their assumption of some demographics that they've kind of had the vote fully from in the past, especially minority ethnic groups. This we've seen in the last several elections, 2018, 2020, 2022, still having a majority from some of those more traditional demographics, but losing voters from Latino populations, from Asian populations, from Black and African American populations, especially from men in those demographics. So I'm watching to see how the party reaches out there, and also how the GOP field, which is becoming more diverse, how that kind of scrambles some of the assumptions about race and gender in the race. And finally, I'm curious how Democrats will kind of frame the issue of democracy in this election as well. In the midterms, we heard a lot about this being a referendum on democracy. That language, I do think, worked pretty well in the midterms, but again, I think Democrats need to be a bit cautious about not framing any opponent or any candidate or any issue in which they disagree as undemocratic, because I think that can backfire a little bit as well. So that's just a word of caution that I hope they don't overreach on that either. But I'm a bit more optimistic in the polarization sense. I don't think we're at the point of political violence, that kind of thing, as we were in 2020.
Michael, can I ask you a question about the role of the media in all this? And it strikes me that it took the US media, maybe the global media, a long time to figure out how to deal with Donald Trump, who, as in so many other things, overturned the apple cart when it came to relations between the White House and the media. Once again, we saw as the extraordinary, the plane took off, the procession through Manhattan, he was on all media all the time. Are the media doing his publicity for him again?
Well, some media, yeah. Yeah, I mean...
And we've because we've heard, haven't we, from people who run the networks, he's good for the ratings.
Well, no, the former head of CNN, help me, Brian... You know who I am. He used to be at... What?
That guy.
That guy. The guy who used to run CNN. He doesn't run CNN anymore. But he said during the campaign in 2016 that Trump would call in. I mean, if you weren't in America, you wouldn't. It was astonishing. The guy never had to take out an ad. He would simply call CNN and he would say something outrageous, and then it would be everywhere because Donald Trump, who is the nominee for the Republican Party, has said something outrageous. This is outrageous, and it became news. And I wish I could say that this is all part of his grand plan. It's not. He's just got a feral intelligence about being the center of attention. I got that this was real because as an American who's lived over here a long, long time, I can see the changes in America more clearly than people who, like Susan, who I respect enormously and who is stuck in the day-to-day minutia of reporting, analyzing, sifting through politics in Washington. But when you step back and you say, well, this is a guy who had a top-rated television show, in a kind of reality television show about getting rich, being successful, there's a huge chunk of America that watches that stuff. He was also on the wrestling programs. Huge chunk of America, his wannabe macho guys with guns, watch those wrestling shows. So that is also the media. You have to understand. You mean news media, and Chris. And I think that there has to be a way of either turning off the spigot. But how do you do that? If he's the nominee of the Republican Party and he tells a bald-faced lie and then just rambles through before a reporter can say, but that's a lie, and say it's a lie to his face, at which point an entire media ecosystem that you, again, don't see here, that styles itself as news, says, oh my God, the ABC reporter called the former president of the United States a liar, and 60 million people, that's the story they're getting. So I don't know how the media plays it. I think that print media, legacy print media, needs to just take upon itself the role of being the truth teller. The New York Times still sets the broadcast news agenda, and the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal, for that matter, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, need to be able to say, Donald Trump lied today about this and this and this, or select stories that remind Americans all the time about, on January 6th, I'm not sure it was a revolution or even an insurrection. It was a mob, but it was a mob whipped up to a frenzy for one purpose, to end the count and certification of the Electoral College. And that is, in a sense, a kind of coup. And people need to be reminded of that. And if it is, again, Trump, I don't really know how else to do it except to ask the leaders of my industry to lead editorially, not on the editorial page, but in their news coverage, and not try and both sides things. And I think if you went through the newsroom at the New York Times and at the Washington Post, people feel like they're in a sluice. They can't get out of it. They don't want to both sides things. They don't want to give Trump credit. And they also need to explore more thoroughly, and I'll stop in a second. The other thing that needs to be explored more thoroughly is, why will 70 million Americans vote for Donald Trump again? I mean, it's pretty clear who he is and his unsuitability. What does that say about America? And to find a way of explaining that, reporting on it in an explanatory way, so people can say, really, our society is this bad, or in this bad a condition.
I'm going to come to questions from the audience in a second. I just want to pick up on one thing that Susan said, and please also respond to Michael's comments, that the Republican Party from before 2016 isn't coming back. Do you agree with that? It's kind of changed for good?
I would. It's changed immensely, and I would say we've seen that mostly through the populist kind of aspect that Trump has tapped into. And some might say that that's not a bad thing, that maybe just the way that Trump has gone about activating that part of the party has been the most off-putting. But it is causing a split in the party from the more traditional pro-business, small government kind of perspective to even some of the policies that I think Trump would push for, but moreover just the character and the kind of rhetoric that is now expected of most candidates, whether they're DeSantis or Haley or Trump. I think we're also seeing the big split on foreign policy, which we might get to later, really almost a civil war in the Republican Party between the more old school traditional hawks, pro-military, very strong America globally, and a much more isolationist, we don't want to be a part of things perspective. And if I can just comment briefly on Michael's point too, which I think is so fascinating, of how the media might cover Trump and this question of striving for objectivity or two sides or not. And I guess the one thing I would hope from coverage is maybe trying to separate Trump from Trump voters this time around, because I do think there's, again, an unintended backlash that happens sometimes when talking about Trump voters in very broad stroke terms that, I heard one anecdote from a focus group where Trump supporters said, look, we feel like the New York Times and ABC News talks about us. We feel Fox News talks to us, and that's why we watch Fox. And I do think that's a very difficult challenge for the media. How do you cover Trump, but also still have some chance of engaging Trump voters in a way that kind of respects and keeps that sense of respect and communication there.
Okay. Any questions at this stage from the audience? There's one over here. We have a microphone at the back, and while your microphone's coming, let me just take one here.
Thanks very much. A couple of questions about the domestic play. How big an issue will voter suppression be? Do you think that'll be material? And on the question of the Veep, is it possible that Biden could run with a different vice president? Because, given his age, I think that could be quite a big negative for the campaign.
Okay, and sir.
Thank you. One thing you haven't touched on is, if Trump, for whatever reason, were not to get the nomination, do you think he would run as a third-party candidate? And if so, how would that disrupt the dynamics? And presumably he would have a much bigger effect than Ross Perot in 1992, I think it was.
Okay, so three issues there: voter suppression, a new Veep, and a third-party candidate or a third-party campaign. Who wants to go first?
I bet you we have the same idea about it. Yes, a third-party candidacy with Trump. Yes, that would be really great. Please. No, yes.
Yeah. Well, I'll just comment just on a more like nerdy response to that. There's actually sore loser laws in over half U.S. states that, at least in theory, prohibit someone who has lost a primary for any of the major parties to run as an independent. So it's very legally murky right now to see how many would employ that, but it's expected that he would not be on the ballot in all states or maybe even the majority of states because of those laws. But he could still he could make a lot of noise from that position regardless, which I think is more damaging.
The sad thing is that it's more likely that a third party attempt, and I'm not sure it'll happen, would come from somewhere inside the Democratic Party coalition, which is what put George Bush into the White House in 2000, which is a turning point, actually. So there's that. Did you want to?
I just had a follow-up, which is the follow-up would be the sore loser clause notwithstanding. Given what you've been saying about the division between the pre-2016 Republican Party and the post-Trump Party, wouldn't there be a huge swathe of Trump Republicans who just wouldn't vote for another Republican candidate? And how would that disrupt the race is the question, I guess.
Yeah, I think we would see the same result that we see in most third-party attempts where it would split the vote among Republicans, or you would have just many people who don't vote that election and it would help the Democrats.
That seems like the natural assumption that if there was a Trump third-party candidacy, that helps the Democrats. That's my math brain.
Yes, I think that's
kicking
the
in.
default logic. But
Let me come back to
voter suppression, because obviously there have been various laws passed in various states. It was a big issue. It's going to be a big issue at this election.
Julie may know more about this than I, but when I was in Georgia in 2018, there was a lot of talk about voter suppression, and again in 2020. And it turned out, it helped turnout. To talk about voter suppression helped turnout for Democrats. And because democracy is essentially on the ballot again, I can't remember the last time I was able to vote in an American election on issues. It was about, this is to prevent crazy people from having the power at the federal level. And we failed in 2016, and crazy people are there. So, and they are crazy. And I'm being objective as a journalist when I say that. They're crazy. So I'm not sure how much voter suppression there really is and how much of it is hype from the Democratic side to get their people out to the polls.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I would say there have been obviously attempts mainly from Democrats during COVID to make voting easier. And the Republican response has been to kind of push back to what it used to be, or even keep some new measures, but not keep it as flexible as it was made during COVID. So I do have concerns about that, and I think people can disagree about that, but the voter suppression language, I think, made it a bit more emotive, definitely very galvanizing for Democrats, but turnout, as Michael noted, has actually gone up in states like Georgia since some of these new laws have been put in place. And I don't think that issue is going away. I don't think it'll be quite as central as maybe it was in these previous elections.
The other one was Biden dumping Harris.
It is. I think it's such an interesting question. I think it would be very difficult for him to do it. She was a historical choice, and I think unwinding and undoing that would alienate. I think the Biden administration fears that would alienate too many voters, and that it's better just to stay the course. But I'm not sure. It would be very interesting if they chose to change.
And I guess because he is quite a loyal person, isn't he? But he also wants to win. So let's see. I actually want to go back to the second clip we have with Susan Glasser, because one of the things I talked about with her was the fact, which Michael alluded to.
The campaign is beginning in very much the way that
That's the first one, anyway. Anyway, well, let me just introduce it, and then I'll explain what we were talking about. As Michael alluded to, there are still tens of millions of Americans. It's easy sort of sitting here, I guess, in kind of liberal London to think, aren't they mad? But there are tens of millions of Americans who still support Donald Trump and who still believe that the 2020 election was stolen. So I guess what I was asking Susan about was her reflections from where she sits in Washington, D.C., about what that says about the state of democracy in the United States. Manuel. Nope. Okay, well, should we come back to that, or? I think we will come back to Susan. Huh? Okay, we'll come back to Susan. Let's go to some more questions before. Wait for the microphone. And then
yes,
the gentleman here.
Very quickly on demographics. I mean, there's a say here in the UK that Brexit won't go through now just because of, had a change in demographics ever since the vote. Are you expecting similar patterns in the US that, the demographic changes since, last election and stuff will be even more in favor of Democrats?
Okay, and...
Hi, I'm an Asian American living here in London, and I just want to answer the question that why do you think so many Americans are voting for Donald Trump? Even in London, I have many experience that a lot of Americans living here wanted me or forced me to vote for Donald Trump in 2020. I used to work for the New York Times, and now I'm working in academia. And I'm actually thinking one of the reasons is because a lot of even the Asian Americans, Latin Americans voted for Donald Trump because Donald Trump represents a fresh. I'm not saying I'm going to vote for him. I'm just stating the fact that Donald Trump represents the freshness and the freshness, and the Democratic is more of establishment, is more of communism or left. So the young generation, young demographics would like to have some freshness, some new elections, some different people. So my question is, since I'm living here in London for almost 10 years, what is your take on the UK and the US relationship after the US election, and what kind of influence the US election going to have on UK?
Okay, so demographics, yeah? Demographics at the back, and then US-UK relationship.
Sure, I can try and respond to the demographic question, which our second participant almost alluded to in a way, because I think as demographics change with incoming immigrant populations, as I alluded to before, Democrats are losing votes among Latino Hispanic populations, among Asian Americans. They still have the majority in those populations, but are losing some ground. And we have seen, especially among some recent immigrant and first generation immigrants, that those are often where some of the votes shift. And some of that is more for economic reasons, not to Trump specifically, I think, but more to the Republican Party and the more focus on free market and some of the economic policies behind that. So I'll maybe turn it to Michael with the second.
Well, demographics, I think demographics kind of do play into your question. And I think part of the problem is that we, as journalists, have got too comfy with a shorthand based on demographic and identity. How will Latinos vote? Do we call them Latinos anymore? Are they Latinx? Well, they're Latinos, they're Hispanics. Who's to say? And in trying to tell the story of what's happening in America, by putting it into demographics and trying to find a statistical or a numerical thing, you miss what's happening on the ground. And I think just in dealing with minority populations, I remember the morning after the election night in 2020, I was driving from Reading to Philadelphia, where the count in Pennsylvania was going on, and everybody knew it was going to be hellacious. Pennsylvania was the crucial state. It was going to be very, very close. And the count was in Philadelphia. And by the way, my sister lives in Philadelphia, so I had a free place to stay. I didn't have to pay for a hotel. So I was driving down there, and on NPR, amazed chatter about the Latino vote not being as good for Biden as within the newsroom it would be expected, because Latinos are a minority, they are people of color, ergo, they're going to vote Democrat. Well, ergo is wrong. People are much more complicated. A lot of these immigrant populations, just to take an example, I mean, Mexican-American immigration surges in the 60s and 70s people are now entering the third generation. People have children young, so you have you have grandparents who are now really established, and they have local voter concerns. They don't want to pay the taxes in California. They don't want people coming not from Mexico, but from Central America, which is a completely destabilized region, destabilized by the United States in the 1980s and continually destabilized by North Americans' needs for drugs. So you can't make these judgments. If you want to, I could talk for 5 hours on this. And I think what happened is there was never any real response at a government level to the deindustrialization of the late 70s and 80s. So places like Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, Michigan, this is a cliche now, but it's true. Those jobs went away. The next generation of workers moved to Arizona or the Sun Belt or Florida, and they got jobs. The parents stayed back, and every day they drive past ruined buildings where they once worked, where their parents once worked. They live amongst ruins, and no one, whether Republican or Democrats, but the Democrats are meant to be, the socially conscious party, did anything about it. And here comes Donald Trump, and he's going to say, well, look, the real reason this has happened is we're being too nice to China. What do people know about being nice to China? I don't understand China, but they buy that. It's a good line. And so at that level, you have people who were left behind for 40 years. You have our own inability in the media to get out and see what's happening in America, to just go away and keep your eyes open and your mouth shut and listen to what's being said to you. And so you come across this weird inability to understand why so many people have forsaken common sense. In Johnstown, Pennsylvania, I was interviewing someone in the Republican Party, Catholic woman, her whole political life. She was 10 years older than I am. So let's say she was in her late 70s, former nurse, is campaigning against abortion. And we were talking, and I said to her, look, I get your point of view, but Donald Trump is a serial philanderer. You know that he's paid for abortions. Why will you back him? And she said, because I know he'll appoint justices to overturn Roe v. Wade. Somebody else, who came back from Vietnam to work at the steel plant in Johnstown, which is basically shut down now, was there with his children, who were in their 40s. And he said, this is where I used to work. He was showing them around. It was by chance. I ran into them. They were voting for Trump. And these things need to be understood, to understand why people won't leave them. And then there's, the propagandizing media that they watch all the time.
You said you could talk about it for 5 hours, and it's fascinating. Unfortunately, we don't have that long, but the relationship with the UK, and maybe we could broaden that out a little bit into the, obviously we don't know who's going to win, but the relationship with Europe, and I guess one of the ways it's really going to matter the next election is the extent of American support for the war in Ukraine, or for Ukraine in terms of the war in Ukraine. Judy.
Yeah, absolutely. This is one area where I think we'll see a divide between the two parties, but also to some degree within the parties as well. To some degree, I think the special relationship is fairly solid. There'll always be generally good ties between the US and the UK, but even right now, the UK is not a high priority for the US, to put it very bluntly. There's a reason why Biden's spending most of the week in Ireland and isn't coming here and whatnot. Brexit, I think, rubbed Biden especially the wrong way, and he's not super keen to engage on stuff until Northern Ireland Protocol was resolved. And there's no real impetus on the US to push for a US-UK trade deal, which is what most prime ministers here from either party are going to want. I do think Biden has obviously, around Ukraine, just reinvigorated NATO after Trump really denigrated it. I do think that will flip back hard if the party in the White House does change in 2024, whether it's Trump or DeSantis. That kind of support, I think, will shift. And Ukraine, I think, I actually think we'll start to see more convergence between the parties on that issue than they currently seem very different, with a growing isolationist wing in the Republican Party. With that said, still a very strong, committed wing within the Republican Party as well. The majority of Republicans still support aid for Ukraine. But I think if we are getting to this time next year and definitely in 2025, if the war is still ongoing, Biden or Democrats are also, their policies on Ukraine are going to be shifting by then, if not well before as well. And I do see this being a very long war and one that's going to get messier and more difficult. And I think the parties will converge a bit on trying to find some nuanced middle ground.
Okay, I'm kind of aware that Susan's been standing there in a slightly unflattering way with her eyes closed for a few minutes, which is not really fair to her. So it was basically asking her more general thoughts on the state of American democracy.
We're in crisis. We have been in crisis for a number of years, and that fact that you just cited is a key data point that is an indicator, I think, of the kind of alarm bells ringing for American democracy. I should state that that is a lie that Donald Trump has been pushing since even before, frankly, the votes were done and counted. It was a premeditated attack on the legitimacy of our electoral process and of our constitutional system. People may not be aware of this, but I found really striking, soon after the 2022 midterm elections, Donald Trump announced formally that he was campaigning to run again for election in 2024. That didn't surprise anybody, but his rhetoric and his campaign platform, I think people have not fully absorbed how much more radical and potentially dangerous it is even than not only 2016 Donald Trump, but even then 2020 Donald Trump. Soon after he announced his 2024 campaign, he said that he was willing even to terminate the U.S. Constitution if that's what was necessary to reinstate him into power. He later followed that up with an extraordinary speech in which he said that basically his campaign platform for 2024 was retribution, as if the United States presidency was a platform for personal grievance and revenge. And I think that, he's a much more isolated character, cut off even from the remaining voices of reason within his party or within his own family. And so this is really, I think, something that is an ongoing challenge to American democracy.
But can you see a roadmap out of the crisis? I mean, is a lot of it around Donald Trump, or it seems to me there are much broader divisions within society? Can you see anyone emerging who could start to bridge those divisions?
Well, absolutely. I think this is an important point. It's not just Trump, but Trumpism at this point that has taken hold firmly over the Republican Party. And remember, even those candidates who might run against him and might even displace Donald Trump, someone like Ron DeSantis is not running as the anti-Trump. He's running as a younger, less legally compromised Donald Trump. Marjorie Taylor Greene, the congresswoman who ran as a fringe candidate embracing the QAnon anti-Semitic conspiracy theory a couple years ago, today she's a Republican power broker who helped to anoint a new Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives and a key endorser of Donald Trump. What's her platform? Her platform is national divorce. That's what she's calling for, a national divorce between the red America of Donald Trump's Republican Party and blue America of Joe Biden's Democratic Party. And I think the Republicans have been the party of division. We called our book about Donald Trump the divider. But what's interesting is that it's this ideology, you might say, of division, of looking at the seams and splinters of American society and seeking to open them up even wider, that has been a style of politics fully embraced by Trump's heirs. Polarization both gave rise to the unlikely election of Donald Trump, but now has been so exacerbated and accelerated by his presidency that there's no reasonable path back. And to the extent there is, we attempted to take that with Joe Biden, who came along promising exactly the kind of return to the status quo ante in our politics that many in both parties hoped for. But it hasn't worked out that way. And I don't think there's anybody today in Washington who would say, oh, yeah, we've gone back to the old normal. It's just, it didn't happen. We're in crisis. We have been in crisis for a number of
Hampshire is very much challenging this, and Iowa is the caucus, and that will happen a little bit later. And part of the reason for this is to be more representative, go to states that are more representative of the Democratic Party, especially in terms of racial and ethnic makeup. So South Carolina, much more representative of African Americans and Black Americans. I think it was I think the fact that Biden got his surge in South Carolina after losing the other ones rubbed some people the wrong way, that his administration was the one pushing to move it there. If he's the main one if he seeks renomination this year and there's not an open primary, it won't really matter for this coming round. I think what will be interesting is if they keep this new way locked in, or if it's going to cycle through different states being the first, because it does give candidates momentum and a surge with the early primaries, and so I do think mixing it up is an interesting move, but it's one that hasn't been tested yet, so we'll see what the effects will be.
And maybe it's fair, because Iowa and New Hampshire always get first dibs, right? So why not give someone else a go? The general media landscape, and maybe addressing the role of social media as well. Of course, one of the first things that Elon Musk did when he took over Twitter was to restore @Donald Trump. Is it @Donald Trump?
He restored
Trump.
Donald Trump's account, and just yesterday NPR withdrew participation in Twitter because. Is that Frank Langfitt? Is he coming up? No.
It is.
It is. Oh, we were just talking about NPR, Frank. No, just to say that will play a difference, and I think that social media really is important because it has become a source of reporting for us, not just where I learn about what's happening in the Middle East or whatever, but it generates its own headlines through the craziness there. So I do think that will continue to play a role, and it will be exploited. Clever people will exploit the outrage there, and you'll have another outrage election.
Okay, Frank, hello. We can all see you on a big screen. I know you can't see any of us probably, but it's Chris Morris here. Are you in Galway? Are you in Dublin? I've sort of lost track of you slightly. You're on mute, Frank. That's one thing I can tell you. Still on mute. You're not on mute. We heard you earlier, Frank. Nope. Technology is always the one thing that defeats all of us. Frank, we can't hear you at the moment, so I'm just going to, hopefully we can get back to you. Julie's got an idea. Can we hear you now, Frank? Okay, let me just come back to, picking up on one of the things that Michael was talking about there. Obviously Donald Trump was the guy who popularized the term fake news. One of his staffers, Kellyanne Conway, immortalized the phrase alternative facts. That was in 2016, 2017, 2018. We're at a stage now where technology has moved so fast. We're going to have, I'm sure, lots of fake videos during this election campaign. Is democracy actually equipped to deal with the speed at which technology is moving?
I don't think so.
Okay, that's an honest answer.
I think it's more as the education system built to deal with it. People arrive with no tools for saying, oh, that just doesn't sound right, and to go to find two other sources, like a journalist. And I think that's a real problem.
Okay, at the moment we can hear the music coming from next door. Can we hear Frank Langfitt? Hi, Frank.
Hi, can you hear me?
Excellent. Hooray, there's a cheer in the room. So I was asking you, are you in Galway now?
I'm in Galway now. I was in Dublin this morning, in the afternoon.
So tell us about Biden's trip, first of all. How's it going? Obviously, it's not a campaign, but he's on the road. It's kind of, maybe it's going to produce some images.
It's
for
interesting.
A campaign.
It's been interesting to watch him. Up in Northern Ireland, perhaps not surprisingly, he was more subdued and he was politically very careful. in the way he spoke to the parties up there. Particularly, it was awkward in the sense that he's there to commemorate the Good Friday Agreement, but of course, Stormont hasn't been, operating for more than a year, which is, a real foundation, obviously, of the agreement. He handled that pretty delicately. Down here, he seemed more energized, not surprisingly, because of his Irish roots, and really thriving, I think, in many ways. One of the things that's interesting, though, I know we're talking about the election, and that is he is 80 years old, and seeing him in person, you wonder about the ability to continue to manage a long campaign. And that's one of the things that comes through. Yet today, I just was watching him at the island, we saw him at the Irish Parliament Day, and he was up at a pub in Dundalk last night, and just also very energized and very avuncular, which is obviously a contrast to some of the people he might be facing on the Republican side.
And Frank, I know you're not based in DC and you're not always with the White
No.
House, but does this feel like a White House that is beginning to gear up for another campaign, given the amount of publicity, negative, positive, call it how you will, that Donald Trump has had in the last couple of weeks? I mean, this is an election which is going to start early, right?
I would imagine so. This does not feel, this is an interesting trip. It's a curious trip because there isn't any major policy initiative here, but it has certainly buoyed his spirit, especially being down here in the Irish Republic. And it's a very warm audience and a lot of glad handing, which Joe Biden is very, very good at. It's hard for me to say if they're gearing up yet. I think I just don't cover it closely enough. And there's a ways to go. As we've seen, and this is true in politics elsewhere, but particularly in the United States, it is so unpredictable. And if you remember, it was going to be Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush when we go back to 2016, and that's not exactly how it turned out.
Okay, more questions from the audience? Gentleman here, and then if you could do this one here, I'll do the gentleman here.
Just wondering if it's going to be vaguely possible to get the parties having a discussion with each other. It seems like they're having completely different discussions. I'm just reading Fukuyama's book on identity at the moment. Whereas it used to be equality versus freedom, it now seems to be all about identity. One's having a national identity, make America great, and the other one's dissolving into some sort of intersectional discussion. It's not even the same discussion, so how do they get together?
Okay, and yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was puzzled to learn that you can be charged for a crime and still qualify for running for the presidency, except, if I've got this right, for the insurrection and treason charges. So what are your prognostics on that? And will that trial happen on time to prevent him from running if he was convicted?
Maybe, Frank, I'll come to you first about on the idea of the two parties sort of talking about different things. So obviously, you're covering global democracy now, and what's your reflection about the way democracy is working or is not working in the United States, given that you do have these very different conversations which appear to be going on?
I think that we've seen in the United States, since I first started covering politics there in Capitol Hill, maybe in the 90s, but even before then, it was a system that worked pretty well, and it really has deteriorated quite badly, certainly in terms of what's been going on Capitol Hill. I think you have, depending on who runs on the Republican side, you're actually going to have a very stark choice. And whether these two parties get together or can agree on much is one thing, but the voters in the United States are going to have a real different choice, probably whether it's Trump or DeSantis and Biden, because the worldviews are so different. And the other thing is that in Biden and Trump, everybody knows them very, very well. So they're going to, I don't know that it's going to be that hard for many people to make up their minds, just as it wasn't all that hard back in 2020. In terms of the challenges to democracy, one of the things that we've seen, obviously in the midterms, is many people who denied the election did not win. I would say there are many faults with the press, but after 2020 in America, there was a tremendous amount of focus on the attempts to undermine democracy. And you'll find the Washington Post certainly the New York Times, NPR. We have deployed reporters to the swing states now for months and months who are waiting to see if there are attempts again to try to undermine democracy. So I think that the American press is actually doing a pretty good job of highlighting this, which is making it harder for different actors to try to undermine the vote in 2024.
Julie, either on the issue of, if you like, two separate conversations going on, or on the issue of insurrection, treason, and the timing of those potential charges if they come?
Yeah, both so interesting. On the question of the charges, I would say, right, not only charged, but even convicted of a crime, Trump could still run. But the question of the insurrection charge, I mean, justice, we don't know to what degree they will indict him or press any charges that may just not go forward at all. If they do, I would be surprised if they go for the insurrection charge for him. I think more likely they will try and look for like fraud, that he was trying to campaign on the allegations that the election was stolen. But the insurrection case, I think, would not be watertight, and it would be very, it would create so much. They need that to be watertight if they're going to go there, and I don't think that they will. The other question I think is so interesting with kind of the diverging sense of identity, this sense of, within the Democratic Party, I would say a split even there between more traditional liberals and more the progressive left, which is more in the intersectional space that you referenced, and then the more hyper-nationalism that is emerging on the right. And so you're right, this divergence of what we're even talking about when we're talking about what it means to be American and what our ideals and for a future America look like, or an American dream, are very different right now, and it's very core to a lot of what's going on.
Michael?
Yeah, I've got Frank. It's interesting because this democracy, global democracy challenge is often focused around leaders who is populist strongmen, whether it's Viktor Orban or Bibi Netanyahu in Israel. And what Orban did before he did anything was take control of the courts, so there'd be no comeback at him for any corruption that might be alleged. And what Netanyahu has precipitated in Israel is an attempt to completely gut the Supreme Court. There is no other check on an Israeli prime minister. And then you've got Trump. And I think it's really possible to imagine him running with that sense of grievance and saying, I'm going to change the law on this.
And is it more difficult? Question to any of you.
Yeah,
really.
Frank, would that even be possible? I mean, do you see that as some kind of campaigning thing for him? He could turn it around and say, democracy, I'll tell you what democracy is, because this is what I get.
Yes, I think, Michael, the challenge in the United States, particularly on the Republican Party side, is while he has a very strong base, as we all know, that can help push him through the primaries, he's going to have to appeal to independents. He lost by millions of votes in 2020. And the idea of looking backwards, there's a lot of polling among some Republicans that, given the challenge the United States faces these days, they don't want a candidate who is running on grievance from something that may or may not have happened 2 or 3, a couple of years back. And so I think that's a fundamental challenge for Donald Trump. A contrast between him looking backwards and a Democrat, in the case of Biden, looking at contemporary challenges that the United States faces. I mean, it's how often can you go back to that well? I know it's a question that people are asking in Republican circles.
And I guess the other side of the democracy question is to what extent have the events of the last couple of years made it a lot more difficult for the United States to preach, whatever word you want to use, around the world about the virtues of democracy?
Let me jump in on that one. Thank you, Chris.
There's a yes from Frank.
Thank you for mentioning that, because Biden said that very thing. He was at Ulster University, I believe it was yesterday when I was there in the room, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, he said, it's not us to tell you guys how to do things. We had an insurrection back in January 2 years back. And so, we're not going to tell you how to do stuff. We would encourage you to try to reopen, the Northern Ireland Assembly. So it was interesting. He was pretty careful about that and very aware that the United States, which for many years lectured people about, finance, about democracy, is no longer in a position to do that at all.
I just want to go back to one of the things that Susan Glasser mentioned earlier, quoting Marjorie Taylor Greene, seeking a divorce between red states and blue states. How worried are you about this coming election season and its campaign to become more inflammatory?
Well, she was serious. I'm in a Swiftian mood. But in 2019, I gave a talk at my local literary festival in Stoke Newington, and it was called DIVORCE, like the country music song. And, I've covered Northern Ireland, Bosnia, civil fighting in Iraq. I know what civil wars look like. Nobody wants a civil war, but I also know that the U.S. American society has reached a point now of being so irreconcilable, one side to the other, that you think, well, is there a way? Because so much needs to be done to, become modern for the 21st century. And it's constantly being pulled back by the political process, which is just where all the battles are fought out. And so you think, how much longer can this go on? And the only thing I can think of is that so long as the American economy remains still the dynamic engine of the world, money can cover a multitude of faults. And so, when we talk about democracy, I often think we forget we're talking about the political process, but the society has to be democratic. It has to have the mental habit, the soulful habit of being democratic. And I think that's one of the things that so disturbs me about the Trump phenomenon, is that he has erased that soulful habit of being democratic, what that means.
Yeah, I will have a maybe slightly different angle. I'm clear-eyed about the polarization for sure. I mean, my own work has shown, like, more than race, class, gender, any of our previous divides, partisanship is the key divider right now. But with that said, I don't see, like, the Civil War divorce kind of level of things just yet. I think in the abstract, the two parties are have a lot of animosity towards each other, but most Americans have friends, coworkers, relatives who are the other party. When you poll people on direct things like, the son and daughter-in-law question, people are much more open to that than I think is sometimes appreciated. So I don't see it devolving to that level, and even just pragmatically, even in cities like New York, 40% of New York is still Republican. So it's, we think of these red and blue states as completely separate, but people are overlapping all the time. So I'm a bit more optimistic on that, even though partisanship is obviously very real right now.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to take the last couple of questions I'll take three then, seeing as you put your hand up. Let's do...
It's a bit of a challenge, actually, on the debate we've been having about democracy. There is a case for saying that democracy is actually working fine in America. An awful lot of people are voting for Trump. We have a lot of people like Trump in the UK. We don't generally elect them as our leader. So is there not a danger in all of this talk about Trump saying, oh, it's a problem with democracy, when it's probably more a problem with inequality, the consequences of the GFC, and those issues which don't seem to be being addressed? I mean, you're touching on them, but they don't really seem to be being addressed.
What impact will Generation Z, the now young voters who grew up with active shooter drills, many of whom will be voting for the first time in their first presidential election, what impact will they have?
Okay, and we have one other question, sir.
Sure, thank you. I guess my question is about the guardrails that are in place between now and the next 4 or 5 years. If Donald Trump ekes out a win in 2024, what does the U.S. look like on Inauguration Day in January of 2029?
Okay, so 3 questions there. I guess this is going to be our last round of answers. And I think it's a really good question that, millions of people vote for Donald Trump. That's kind of how democracy works. And all those people who don't like him, and people vote for, they have a choice, and they exercise that choice. So that question, the kind of crystal ball 2029 question, and Generation Z. Let's start with Julie.
Okay, so the democracy question, I think, is spot on, because even on January 6th, I would not excuse anything that happened there, but people who were part of that, most were very much convinced that they were defending democracy. So I wouldn't say that there's a sense that people are anti-democratic so much as what our facts and what our views are there. And as I said before, I caution Democrats to overstate what is undemocratic when it's things that are just things that they disagree with. On the Gen Z question, I would say, when young people vote, that usually helps Democrats, but that does still tend to be where we have low voter turnout. So I do think that is shifting the Democratic Party already. I think the progressive side of the Democratic Party is growing very much from young voices, but in terms of actual turnout, that tends to be a low turnout group.
Frank, could you hear the questions okay in the room?
I could.
Okay, so
I think
your thoughts.
Yeah, I think on democracy, I think it is proving to be pretty resilient. So I'd agree with that point. I mean, I think if we look at what did happen in 2020, and even in terms of the insurrection, and then the efforts at the state Secretary of State level, and in some of the states that are swing states, to make sure that the systems were more robust going forward. I think that has been good. I think you see incredible turnouts that you've seen in Israel by protesters is quite encouraging. But I do think that what you saw in 2020 were attempts, unlike anything I've ever seen as an American, to try to actually undermine the system. And I think the system is kind of the most important thing in some ways. You're always going to have, and probably for quite a long time, a very polarized America with a lot of differences of opinion and sometimes very bitter. But the important thing is to have a system that has genuine integrity. And we saw something we hadn't seen before, which is really trying to undermine it. So I think that's one of the things that I'm going to be looking towards in the next couple of years is, the strength of those institutions in the United States as elsewhere, because I think they're really, really important.
Okay, Michael, the last word's yours, and in particular, if you could address lyrically address the crystal ball questions. If Trump were to win, what would America look like on Inauguration Day, if there was one, in 2029?
Yeah, in 2020, if there was one, yeah. When his son-in-law or his daughter is elected, I don't know. I think that, like I say, I don't think he'll. I think he'll run, and I don't think he'll win. But I think that the danger is this is has been a project of the Republican Party going back practically to Watergate. It's a revenge project. Newt Gingrich has been articulating this since he first ran for Congress in 1976 and got in 78 or got in 76, whatever. There is an attempt to create a kind of one-party state, and that is not democracy. And if you have the levers of control over the judiciary, which they've campaigned and they've got the Supreme Court, if you have a kind of rubber stamp, both houses of Congress, Trumpist party, I think you can begin to see an Orban-like transition. You could still call it democracy. And as I said earlier, so long as the American economy is stupendous, and it still is stupendous, and in spite of measures of poverty, most Americans are okay. I think that people would not necessarily come out in the streets to fight back against that, although I am inspired by Israel and surprised. Because again, what happened was a lot of the people who come out now spent decades not really paying attention to these undemocratic forces using democratic means to ultimately get Netanyahu back to power and get control of militias in the West Bank. And I think that, it could wake people up. But, I can't see beyond 2024. And to go back to our first question, You know, I'm at an age now where I have friends call me up with the bad diagnosis. You get them. He's 80, and at any day, he can get a bad diagnosis. And then what? Trump is obese. He's in terrible condition. He could get a bad diagnosis anytime in the next 18 months. So what are we talking about?
Yeah, indeed. Well, yeah, and who can predict the future? And looking further afield, I guess, the next US president could face the very real prospect of a conflict with China over Taiwan, and things can change very quickly. But for now, I wanted to ask you about that, but I think we have run out of time. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you to our panel. Frank, live from Galway, thank you for joining us. And in the room, Michael and Julie.